This is a very exciting session. I hope you can all hear me and the rest of the panelists. We have an hour. We're going to be focusing on implementation, as we've just heard the business declaration in Indonesia. This session is looking at how sustainable business is progressing across Asia. It's an enormous topic. We have an hour. We have a fantastic panel of 5 speakers, all at senior level, leaders in different sectors: energy, agribusiness and food, and ICT. So we have a really rich experience. We have lessons from China and elsewhere. We're going to be relevant to Indonesia to look at how the business commitments can be implemented. We're going to speak for 25 minutes and then have 35 minutes of discussion with all of the distinguished delegates at the conference. And I'm not going to say very much to begin with. I just want to say a couple of points. First of all, our sympathies obviously with the victims of the tornadoes in the southern USA happening over the last 24 hours, terrible natural disaster relevant to this discussion. Secondly, we welcome the Chinese Premier, who is in Indonesia, indeed staying in this hotel last night, and is looking to significantly increase trade between China and Indonesia, which already last year exceeded $43 billion and is growing in double digits at the moment. So sustainable business in Asia is very relevant to the most senior level of decision makers in Asia. Thirdly, many of you will have heard the commitments and the really impressive speech by Indonesia's president yesterday, and fantastic that the business has come behind the president in delivering that goal. So congratulations to Kadin, to the investment board, and to all Indonesian businesses for making such a strong commitment, which is really exemplary. Fourthly, this is a great opportunity for Asian businesses. Conservative estimates that the size of the green economy by 2020 will be a minimum $3 to $5 trillion. At the moment, the lion's share of the progress is being made by a few countries in Asia, not by the majority of countries. So there is some catching up to be done by some Asian countries, including Indonesia. Investors don't always come to Indonesia. They don't always go to other Asian countries. They often go to China and Korea, and not even Japan. That needs to change, because to create a global economy cannot be the task of just a few countries. So this is a real agenda. That's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to pass straight over to our first speaker, Mr. Daud, from PT Smart, and President Director of PT Smart, Agribusiness and Food, and he's going to talk to us for 5 or 6 minutes about PT Smart's journey to become a sustainable business in palm oil.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Alex. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all of you. I'm from PT Smart, as introduced by Alex, the subsidiary of Golden Agri Resources in Singapore. Our business is palm oil business, palm oil industry. So in the sustainable business in Asia, I'll focus my discussion in the palm oil industry. I'll try to define the sustainable business. What I'll try to define is sustainable business is a business to meet present needs without harming the environment and without compromising the ability to provide the needs for the future generation. So here we are talking about three factors. That is the profit, planet, and the people. Where these three factors overlaps, that is the sustainable business. Now, since I'm from the palm oil industry, let us see and let us focus on the vegetables oil. From the fourth major vegetable oil, the world demand of four major vegetable oils, which increase from year to year, the increase of the demand is always met by the production of the vegetable oil. That means the expansion, the land expansion. Now, how do we see this from the industry point of view? The world vegetable oil demand is about 120 million ton in a year, and palm oil contributes 39% of this 120 million ton demand. Palm oil is the most efficient crop production in the vegetable oil. Since I'm from PT Smart, let me discuss about the sustainability policies of PT Smart. PT Smart has been by the way, we are one of the biggest. I'm not saying we are the biggest. We are one of the biggest palm oil industry in Indonesia, and we have about 430,000 hectare planted, of which about 110,000 hectare is smallholders. We have been doing our operation in a sustainable way from the beginning. Are we perfect? No, we are not perfect. But we are committed to taking the leadership role in finding solutions to ensure the long-term and sustainable growth of the palm oil industry in Indonesia, the growth of the Indonesian economy, and to improve the life of our people. Well, palm industry is a I would say, labor-intensive, and it creates jobs. It also creates poverty alleviation for Indonesia. So far, with the total 7.6 hectare of oil palm planted in Indonesia, there are about 4 million manpower working for oil palm industry. Now let us see PT Smart sustainability policy, which we hope that this policy can also be adopted by the industry, not only in Indonesia, but also in the region. Our sustainable policy is, the first one is with conformity in line, in the corridor with the government regulation. The second one is the local community engagement. We have to engage with the local community in the way of improve the livelihood of the community and education for the children. Without livelihood improvement, there will be poverty everywhere in Indonesia, and there will be shifting cultivation that we quite difficult to control. And education is also the most important issue for our country. The better education, then they know what to do and what not to do. The third is the optimizing the usage of the natural resources. The important thing of this issue is yield improvement. I did mention that consumption increase, but the rate and production always meet the consumption. But the growth rate of the consumption is greater than the growth rate of the production. That means yield improvement is one of the most important things. The fourth item that I put here is sustainable operation. Our company, we are not doing burning since 1997. We are not doing pit since February 2009. We are not doing HCV based on RSPO principle and criteria. HCV is high carbon value forest or area. And the last policy is we are not planting on high carbon stock forest. This is how to conserve the forest. So with these policies, with these PT Smart policies, we cannot do it alone. We cannot do it alone. We have to do it together.
Mr. Daud, Can I ask you to pause there? We take some opening comments from the rest of the panel, and then we'll come back to the second round of discussion.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay.
The key success of this policy is there got to be a common understanding of the global sustainability. There got to be a support from the government by way of rules and regulation. There got to be the support from the key players of the palm oil industry. The palm oil industry got to buy this idea, and there got to be a support from the other stakeholder. Without this, the success is almost impossible. Thank you.
Well, that certainly sets the agenda and shows how a company can set out a consistent set of policies and implement them. Let's move on to Derren, who is Director of Sustainability Asia Pacific for SAP, and very appropriately Derren Green. So I'm sure that's not the first time that terrible joke's been made. But Derren, you can help companies do this as well. So 5 minutes, please, on.
Okay, so very quickly, SAP is the largest application vendor in the world of business applications. About 65% of the world's GDP runs through our systems every day. We have sort of 100,000 customers, and at our last survey, about 1/3 of all man-made, 1/6 of all man-made emissions come from our customers. So we've got quite a large responsibility to improve their operations, to make even incremental changes. If we can make them 10% more efficient, that's a really big impact for us. So we don't see the problem for us as a green IT issue. It's a supply chain. It's how you do business. And in order to facilitate that, what we need our customers to understand is that sustainability, and I'm probably going to get shot for saying this, it's not about the environment, it's not about polar bears, it's not about all these things. It's a vastly bigger topic. And at the end of that, that topic is driven by profit. So what we need to do is get people to understand that sustainability is not about adding cost to your business. It's not about cutting the way you have to behave things. It's about saving money, and it's about growing revenues. And all of those things add to profit. Unfortunately, I would love to live in a world of 20, 30 years future when we all behave beautifully, but at the moment we're driven by a measure in our countries called GDP and a measure of profit and share price in our companies. So the only way to change those behaviours is to get people to understand that sustainability is about good business, and it's about driving incremental improvements into your business, and in doing that, adding value to your business and adding value to the communities and the environment around you. It must make business sense, or people will conveniently ignore the topic. Okay. So we look at it as there's 4 elements. So the first one is compliance. There were 2,000 new laws in the world last year around chemical compliance, environmental compliance, reporting on carbon, occupational health, all those sorts of things. So you need to be able to manage those more efficiently, and that's a role of IT. So once you are tracking carbon, for instance, and a lot of people say, well, what's the point in tracking carbon? How do I make money out of that? It's just adding cost. That's wrong. Carbon is a proxy for business efficiency, for process efficiency. So the only way, unless you're a forestry company, the only way you can emit carbon is to consume energy. So if we can help people track their energy use, that we can teach them how to reduce it. An example of that, a large petrochemical company we work with in the US, they implemented our systems across 7 of their 16 facilities. In the first year, so in 2009, they saved $120 million worth of electricity, just because they could see where they consume it, and they can therefore turn the machines up and down and manage that. They'll roll that out across the other plants this year, and they'll save $200 million in energy year on year. That's bottom line saving, and that's good business. It's good for the environment, it's good for everything, but the bean counters can understand that, the accountants can understand it. So we have to help our customers understand how to decrease cost, and at the same time, using that to then differentiate themselves in the market, to become a leader of a new green product. Unfortunately, we see a lot of customers in Asia that I work with thinking only of their, what does sustainability mean for me? The average person on the street in Jakarta, what do they think about it? And for most of the large businesses, that's the wrong question. It's not what the person in Jakarta thinks about it, it's what my mum thinks about it. because she's the one buying shampoos, etc., in another country. What does she think about palm oil? You only need one controversy, and things like palm oil, forestry, whatever the topic might be, they can be very controversial. And you know, before we saw Indonesia's going to grow by 7%, a lot of that growth coming from export markets. We need to raise the view of what a sustainable product is and what that means to those export markets. Because at the end of the day, it's my mum and everyone else's mum in the US or Europe or wherever that might be that's buying products containing raw materials from these regions. So sustainability needs to be about profit and good business sense, or from our point of view, it won't work.
Thank you very much, Derren. Now, I don't know whether one of your customers is State Grid of China, world's second biggest company with 1.25 million employees, 80 or 90% of China's electricity. But I do know our next speaker knows the company extremely well. So this is Peggy Liu, who is chair of the JUCCCE, the Joint US-China Consortium on Clean Energy, an NGO, but Peggy is also a young global leader of tomorrow from the World Economic Forum. 5 minutes, please, perspectives on how you can move big institutions in a big system and a huge economy like China, and whether there's learning there for countries like Indonesia and other Asian countries.
So I talked about this a little bit in the plenary and then our workshop yesterday, but I wanted to start off and just say that I began in the energy industry just 5 years ago. I'm a mother of 2 young children, 6 and 8, who are with me today. And they think that mom's job is to clean the air so that they can breathe it. And they've very happily started helping me clean that air by doing videos on how to save the water, how to do worm composting. And I think the brilliant thing about the world today, especially from my vantage point in Shanghai, China, and Beijing, is that change can happen, and it can start with an individual. Especially in China, where as long as you understand who holds the seat of power and how you can enable that person with solutions and help them provide those solutions, deploy them in practical ways, change can happen at very large scale in China, which is why I, as an American citizen, am now based in China trying to help accelerate the greening of China. In the plenary yesterday, I talked about our experiences with smart grid and helping accelerate the introduction of smart grid into China with the help of our partners from the US Department of Energy to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to GE and many other players. But we also worked on a second tipping point, which happened in 2010. Before 2010, all the fashion magazines didn't cover green issues. There was really only one magazine that had a annual green issue called Elle in China. And in 2010, there was this blossoming where every single magazine had a green cover, a green feature, et cetera. And JUCCCE and our ambassadors were in every single one of those issues. So the movie star that we trained to the China's first top supermodel that we trained to be green advocates, myself and other team members. And this was a really interesting tipping point that we had been working on behind the scenes to create. And this is the power of bringing people together. So the power of collaboration I've talked about over and over and over again. And I've talked about the concept of stone soup leadership, which is essentially what JUCCCE does. And it's interesting that in the hallways here, people have asked me several times, how do we create a JUCCCE of Indonesia? And we've been asked about how to create a JUCCCE of Taiwan or JUCCCE of Costa Rica, JUCCCE of the Philippines, et cetera. I don't think they're asking about how to create a joint US-China collaboration of clean energy in these countries. I think they're talking about how do we create a platform for collaboration. So a couple of our simple rules. One is we only work with people who already understand the need and the urgency of going green, like our fellow panel members here. 2, we only work with smiley people, because they're easier to work with. 3, you know.
Everyone's smiling on the panel.
It's worked for us. And 3, we believe in working with convening the top of the top. So we typically work with CEOs, CTOs, mayors, you know, ministers, et cetera, because we believe that that platform then brings other people to the platform. 4, we really work on the most practical, easy to achieve win-win situations that can be accomplished within 3 years or less. So all of our programs, no matter if it's in factory energy efficiency, sustainable consumption, sustainable urbanization, sustainable collaboration, all have sort of a cap of 3 years or less, which is very different than the normal energy timeframes of 10, 20, 30 years. And again, this shows the power of collaboration, the multiplier effect. I'll give an example of one of the smaller programs that we've worked on, which is Expo Reuse, Expo Building Material Reuse. So as many of you know, in 2010 we had the Shanghai World Expo, and we had 80 pavilions that all cost 80 to 100 million each. Now what happens to the building materials after the expo? We went around and convinced 9 of these pavilions to donate their waste materials, and we're launching the building of a new secondary school in Shanghai that will launch this fall. And this is an example where if you can create a very compelling shared vision, a very tangible success story, so this image of a school, and you show people how they can, in their individual ways, contribute to this project, and you celebrate everybody's contributions, then we can together create great things. So in this case, we're showing reuse, which is a largely ignored one of the 3 R's in China, and we're trying to convince the Chinese government, the local Chinese government, about ways to create platforms for easier reuse. So I think that individuals can, if we think about each of us, rather than corporations and as governments, but think of us as human beings, and that each of us have sort of human nature, rules of human nature. We have our own incentives for going green, like Derren was implying, whether it's making green while going green, you know, or changing the world as NGOs, or, you know, creating the next, you know, clean nuclear power plant. We all have, you know, the individual human being reasons for going green. If we can help articulate those incentives, help align those incentives, we can do great things. So that's sort of my NGO message of collaboration.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Peggy. I suggest that we continue down the panel. So Arpin, can I ask you to speak next? Arpin, we're a disaster President Director of PT Dana Yasa Artatama, which is part of the Artigraha network. And obviously Artigraha needs no introduction to Indonesians, with fantastic displays downstairs, which I hope everyone has been to see, and you'll be taking a group of delegates on an exciting trip tomorrow morning. I'm sorry I can't join you on that, but if I can ask you to give us a 5-minute overview of Artigraha's journey towards being a sustainable business. Thank you.
Okay, audience. Good afternoon. We are here, and we all know that climate change with the global warming have a negative impact in the crop yielding, decrease ocean acidification, and the rising of sea level and ecosystem, and also the temperature of the earth. We all know it will have an impact in the food and also health stress for all of us in the world. Since we also know that the crop yielding have been impacted very much by the natural disaster. Just the moderator said there's a tornado in the US now. So very, very concerned about this. Then what should we do to cover all these things? We have to make some guidelines for sustainable business in Asia. One is that we have to start from our own kids, how to teach them, how to raise them, how to manage them to love the earth, starting from the small things. You know, why I said that? Because I have a second daughter who is a member of WWF Youth Program. And funny story, sometimes I throw away the papers into the trash bin, and my daughter said, don't do that, because that is not the spot of papers. You have to do the other trash bins. That's why one simple thing that I have to let everybody, audience here, knows. And the other thing, coming back to Asia. Asia is predicting to 4.7 billion population in the year 2025. It's very rapidly growing and fast increasing in the population in Asia. In this case, the consequences is the food, consumption and consumer. Because the characteristic, the culture of Indonesian and Asian countries is a middle-up consumer. So it will be, in fact, if we cannot change anything about the climate change and global warming. So we have to maintain this condition, and we have to be aware this global change, global warming, climate change will make some disaster and health stress and malnutrition. Indonesia is a country in Southeast Asia with a population up to 238 million until now, and we have 17,508 islands. So besides the tropical climate in Indonesia, we also have a geography like archipelago. And 60% of this country is covered by forests. But, I have to be honest to the audience now. 60% of our tropical forests is lost already. We are very concerned about this. And why? Because of illegal logging and smuggling. But something that I never understand, why the other world still buy the product from tropical trees. So we are very concerned. But at the end, in Indonesia, everybody, and I ask and I advise the media, especially in the world, Indonesia is just a victim of illegal logging and smuggling. We didn't do it. How we can save the earth if our tropical forest is the second number of biodiversity after Brazil has lost? And who is going to make a replantation about this kind of thing? So I will suggest, and I will ask this forum, not to buy any single product from wood from tropical forests. I appreciate that. And going back to our company, Atagraha Network, the basic principle of our business, especially advancing sustainable business in Asia, we built a company not because of getting profit only, but we built the company and measure the company how much the company will contribute to the public sector. And 1 minute more, okay? I will introduce, besides of corporate social responsibility, we have do the reservation, the rescuing of endangered species, flora, fauna, in tumbling wildlife nature conservation. We rescue tiger, we released to the natural tiger, and just 2 days before, we just translocated 1 tiger and 1 crocodile from Bengkulu to tumbling wildlife nature conservation. And again, finally, I have to thank to this event, to this forum, and if I may suggest, please help us, because Indonesia is rapidly transitioning from a rich forest country into become pure forest country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arpin. And our final panelist then is Bret, and I'd like to give Bret another 25 seconds longer than the other speakers to introduce his shirt before he starts talking about Star Energy, his company, because there's an interesting story that I'd like to share with the rest of you. So if I can hand over to Bret, and again, 5 minutes, please.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. I try not to focus on my shirt, actually, but the reason I wear it is that it has a wayang. The batik comes from Cirebon, but the motif is wayang, and my company, which is a geothermal electricity generator, runs a project called Wayang Windu in West Java, south of Bandung, which is the most efficient geothermal project in the world. So I like to wear something that represents Wayang Windu. It's the least loud of my shirts, actually. So
thank you again for that.
In my few minutes, I just wanted to carry on the theme that the coordinating minister began with this morning, and look at the big picture, or the big story for Indonesia. And the big story in the context of what we're talking about is that this country produces 2.1 billion tonnes of global warming pollutants every year. So that's the number that we're looking, the government and all of us in a coordinated fashion are looking at reducing by somewhere between 26 and 41% within 9 years. Difficult task. I represent, or my company as activities, part of the energy sector. Energy at the moment represents only about less than 20% of that 2.1 billion tonnes of emissions. The 2.1 billion tonnes is very predominantly a reflection of what happens in the forestry industry and in peat farming. But energy is the most rapidly growing of the sectors, and by 2020 it will represent 35% roughly of the emissions from the entire nation. By 2030, closer to 50%. The drivers for that rapid growth, or that rapid increase in the proportion of emissions coming from energy, are the obvious ones. A rapid pace of economic development, which means that people can buy bigger, less efficient houses and install air conditioning in those houses to keep themselves cool. And that leads to, of course, rapid growth in electricity demand. And electricity demand is the economy here is growing at 6% a year. Electricity demand is growing at closer to 12% a year. Virtually impossible for government and industry to keep pace with that growth in demand, actually. It's related to increase in natural gas use. It's related to increases in ownership of personal vehicles. There'll be 7.5 million additional motorcycles put on the road in Indonesia, most of them in Java, just in this calendar year. I think a remarkable statistic is that only 4% of primary energy use in this country is from renewable energy, renewable sources. And if there's any country in the world, any country in Asia that should have a very high proportion of its primary energy use related to renewable sources of energy, it's this one. And I hope that later on through the questioning we can come back to that issue. We know that the President has confirmed just yesterday, and to my knowledge that's the 4th time in a public forum that the President has reaffirmed that the country will reduce its emissions by 26% at least, and with some assistance from the OECD by 41% in 10 years, 9 years actually. For the energy sector, that represents, it's a fairly specific number. It's about, if if we're to reduce emissions from the energy sector by 2020 by 26%, that's 230 million tonnes of global warming pollutant, CO2 equivalent. For 41%, it's 370 million tonnes. As part of a collective organisation in this country that got going last year and already has about 60 members, I think, called the Association for Low Carbon Businesses in Indonesia, ALBI, that organisation's most of this analysis comes from collective work by the companies in that group. That group's identified the different abatement options that Indonesia has at its disposal. The abatement levers for power generation are, and they'll be obvious to everybody in this room, but worth restating. The substitution of fossil fuels by renewable sources of energy, the substitution of oil and coal by natural gas, particularly natural gas, combined cycle gas turbine type power generation. The installation of supercritical boilers and other clean coal technology. There are none in Indonesia at the moment. And the deployment of carbon capture and storage. And for transportation, the abatement levers, again, very obvious. Increase in engine efficiencies. I wish I could say that wasn't rocket science, but in fact it is. It is rocket science. And the use of biofuels and gas. So as I said, we've identified, as a group, have identified 230 million tonnes of energy sector abatement. We think that that is easily achievable. The coordinating minister talked about the cost of abatement versus the cost of not taking any action. The cost of abatement is actually, for this country, remarkably cheap. For more developed economies, the United States and Japan, the marginal costs of abatement are very high. They're not high in Indonesia, they're not. We have very easily identified 230 million tonnes of abatement activities that could begin tomorrow, in fact have. The cost to everybody involved in that abatement effort, about $20 per tonne of CO2. Now that equates, in 2020, that will equate to about $1.5 billion of expenditure. That, just to put that in context, that is 15% of the current annual fuel subsidy bill in this country. 15%. If you go to 41% reduction, and the 370 million tonnes that I mentioned, the costs are a little higher because you have to go to slightly more complex solutions, not much more complex actually. There the costs are $35 a tonne of CO2. If you add that all up, it comes to about 80% of 1 year of Indonesia's fuel subsidy bill. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Just one closing sentence, which is that this is all very achievable. It's all very, very achievable, but it's going to require a coherent national energy policy. It's going to have to be implemented soon, and that policy is going to have to coordinate and direct public and private investment.
So, congratulations to all the speakers for sticking to time. I know it's really tough to get a core message across about your companies that you've built and run in 5 minutes. I don't know whether it's harder in 10 minutes or in 3 minutes, but anyway, you do a great job in 5. That leaves us about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. I'm not going to ask any questions of the panel. I would love to. I've even got my questions prepared, but I can see we've got a packed house. So I'm going to throw the questions straight over to the audience. And my understanding is that we don't have any prepared questions or any planted questions by any of the panelists. So this is a brave moment because you can ask anything you like and the panelists will do their best to answer it. And they'll be as brief as you are in asking the questions. So please, no presentations. Please just questions, and then the panelists will please just give answers, okay? That's the only rule I'd ask for. So who wants to ask the first question? Yes, we have our first question, and people meanwhile pluck up the courage to ask the second question while we're having the first question. Thank you. And if you could say who you are, and if you represent an organization, the name of the organization, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tito. I'm from Molindo, an ethanol company. This is a specific question for brand mates. As we know that Indonesia is known for the largest geothermal potential country in the world, I would like to know what is your experience on developing one of the first geothermal generator in Indonesia, the Wayang Windu. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Wayang Windu has actually been going for 11 years now. So it was explored and developed in a totally different political setting, if you like. It is the most efficient project in the world, and you know, I admire my company for being able to say that, but it's partly the luck of the geography that it is just an amazing, the best steam field that's yet been developed in the world. And I mention that because it goes to the heart of your question. And your statement that Indonesia has the most geothermal potential in the world is undeniable. In fact, of the easily commercializable geothermal that's identifiable in the world, Indonesia has significantly more than half. So it's somewhere between 55 and 60% of the global potential for geothermal. And it's an enormous potential competitive advantage for Indonesia. Total potential here, we think, my own company analysis, is about 30 gigawatts of generation capacity. And that's only picking very high temperature type geothermal development. If you start to go to lower temperatures, then it's probably 3 or 4 times that. So it highlights the fact that Indonesia has the potential, certainly has the physical potential. Now what it needs to do is develop the political will and the policy to support the development of geothermal. Geothermal's never had any breaks here. It doesn't get any tax breaks. There's no subsidies or anything, but it's a viable business. And I don't think any of the developers that are trying to get the business, you know, to the next level here are looking for government support, looking for subsidies, not even looking really for tax breaks. But there needs to be an even playing field. There needs to be an appropriate tariff. There needs to be, and the tariff needs to be appropriately structured so that investors will invest their capital in geothermal. That's starting to happen. It's starting to happen. There's a new wave of geothermal development that's just getting going now. At the moment, there's only about just over 1 gigawatt of geothermal capacity in the country. As I said, that could be 30 gigawatts, which would more than double the current grid. So our experience is that it's a terrific business. It's clearly an extremely important part of the future for Indonesia. There have been institutional barriers in place that have, if not prevented, certainly slowed down the growth of the geothermal industry in the country. That's changing, and the industry is about to enter a new spurt, gain a whole new level of momentum.
Thank you very much. Who wanted to ask the second question? I'm sure I saw a hand. And let's take a third question as well, so we can rack up a few and put some more panelists on the spot. So can we see some more hands for a third question, please? Yes, okay, so number 3. So
Alex, can I just jump in and say that I'd like to give an example of collaboration with geothermal here in Indonesia. This morning I was having breakfast with some people here at the conference, and they were saying we have 6 to 7 factories of maybe 20,000 people or more in each one. And what we'd like to do is bring them together to do bulk buying of geothermal power. So this is an example where a convener, not necessarily an NGO, but a convener could go to multiple companies and say, would you like to do bulk buying, and let's go negotiate with Bret over here. But then Bret is happy because he has volume, and he can then create another power plant.
Just do it. Yeah. Okay, let's one and then two.
Thank you for the chance. Good afternoon. I'm Christian Timothy. I'm a student from East Java. My question is, how is the way to empower all company, industries, and business to join the movement for this sustainability for the environment? Is there any way started from this Global Summit conference to ask and to gather all kind of business to have same idea to keep Earth in the very good condition? Thank you.
That's definitely a question that each of the panelists should answer, the empowerment question. While you're preparing your answers, let's take the third question from the gentleman over in the corner.
Yes, hi. My name is Hilman from Bluebird Group. My question is that it's regarding the public transportation in Indonesia. We would like to know, in your perspective, by seeing the situation in Indonesia at the moment, I would like to know, are we ready yet to have hybrid public transportations? And in order to achieve that, are there any steps? Could you give us some examples from overseas, for instance? How do they achieve the hybrid public transportations? Thank you.
We don't have a transportation company on the panel, but I'm sure that at the minimum SAP has a lot of expertise in that sector, and information is definitely part of the solution certainly in Jakarta, from my experience. So, Derren, maybe you could tackle that question as part of your empowerment response. But if we can run down the panel from Daud on tackling the empowerment question, and then Derren, just to make you work even harder, if you can just do transportation as well, that would be great. Peggy, you'll also have some ideas about China's amazing progress in public transportation, although I don't know if high-speed rail is on the agenda in Indonesia at this stage, but you'll also have some ideas.
Yep, so
if you could start on how to empower and inspire the next generation through your company's work.
Well, to answer the for the first question, to answer the first question is the key is we have to do it together in order to have the business sustainable, especially in our industry, in my industry, in the oil palm industry. We have to do it together with the all stakeholders, including the government. There always a misunderstanding or misperception between or amongst the stakeholders between the legal understanding of the rule and regulation in Indonesia and a physical point of view. A good example is the land allocated for the oil palm development. Yeah? Land allocated for the oil palm development, according to the government regulation, it is legal based on the rule and regulation in Indonesia. After we deduct a certain percentage of the area of the land that cannot be cultivated because of government regulation, for example, river riparian, for example, the stiffness of the stiffness of the area, and then we also deduct the suitability of the land because it is not suitable for oil palm industry, and also based on the international. Like, for example, RSPO principle and criteria, the HCV area, high conservation value area that cannot be developed the balance, we can develop according to the Indonesian rule and regulation. But the other stakeholders also see it from the physical point of view. The area, even though it is legally can be developed, but if the area is still having the area is, for example, having a high carbon stock, still have a primary forest over there, then this cannot be, according to a few stakeholders, another stakeholders, this cannot be developed because it contains high carbon. So,
okay, so can I just try to encapsulate your response there? It's about convening all of the stakeholders.
Actually, the key is the common understanding of the global sustainability. Then a reconciliation between the rule and regulation and the physical condition of the land. Once it is met, then we can do the business sustainable.
Fantastic, thank you. Derren, you've got a double challenge now,
right.
And the time is marching on, so I think we only have about 5 or 7 minutes left for the whole session. So if people could be, it's a sort of 1 minute per point.
Okay, very quickly on the transportation question. So we work with a lot of transportation companies and airlines. For airlines, the issue is really about fuel optimization, and the same for road and rail freight as well. A lot of it, therefore, comes down to the shape of the vehicle, the type of fuel, and for road transportation, the driving style. We have customers in Australia that have saved something like 20% of their fuel bill simply by educating their drivers how to drive, to not stop, start, to keep rolling. Other organisations use a lot of GPS equipment to change their route so that they're not stopping at traffic lights and trying to turn into oncoming traffic, and they'll go do a left turn, a left turn, a left turn, and then go that way. And they've saved something like 70 million litres of fuel just by changing where they drive, and not even necessarily how they drive. And then working with the products that you're transporting and change the packaging and the way that packaging fits into the truck to optimise that. So there's actually quite a lot happening in the transportation area to optimise that. If I was, and to address the other question, the one thing that everybody can do to try and start making a difference, and I'll challenge everyone in this room to do it, and that would be to go to the organisers of this event and make sure that next year we have a member of the International Accounting Standards Board here and get them to stand up as to why do we only measure profit. I think that would be the biggest and quickest way to change everything.
There's a concrete recommendation. Peggy, the onus is on you to be even more concrete, if you can.
Sure. So in terms of an example of how JUCCCE works with businesses, you have to remember businesses want to make money. So yes, they want to do good, but in the end, if you can help them figure out how to make more money and get to the right target market, then they'll want to work with you. So an example of a program that we're investigating right now is factory energy efficiency in export goods in China, which is about 35% of energy use in China. So the problem that we're having on the ground is that these poor Chinese factory workers and managers are being bombarded by all their suppliers who have different requirements for environment and water and for social compliance, etc. And at the same time, they're being bombarded by different government standards from different countries. So if JUCCCE can sit in the middle and help convene different retailers and convene one single set of expectations, make it easily understandable to the factories, then the factories won't be paralyzed because of the changing expectations. They'll be able to easily make energy efficiency improvements. So that's an example of how you can encourage businesses to work with you if you show them that through the power of collaboration, they can multiply, 1 + 1 is not 2, it's not 3, it's 11, right? So that's one concrete example.
Also, I think given the time, and given the topic about empowerment, these, in a sense, are our kind of closing comments from the panel, in fact. So if you could kind of roll that into your closing comment, answering the question about how Artigraha is leading this empowerment process in Indonesia.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. As I said, and I told the audience before that, before we start the business in Artigraha network, we have to make a research how is the impact of this kind of business to the public sector, especially for the environment. And if the impact is too negative for the environment, then we have to change the business. And the other point is, we have to let you know that Atagraha Network have 4 pillars in the line of business: finance, resources, agriculture, and then the others business is telecommunications, transportation, and so on. And now, besides of our business in Atagraha Network, we emphasize our corporate social responsibility, and we make also the foundation, name it Atagraha Peduli, who oftenly active in national disaster, social welfare, to push up the education, and the last is tumbling wildlife nature conservation. That's all. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Bret, final thoughts from you, please.
I love that question. Thank you for asking it, because it cuts to the guts of why we're all here. And Peggy mentioned a couple of times as well, you know, how important it is and how valid it is for individuals to take action. And success in a movement like the one we're talking about starts with individuals and with small groups, with individual companies, with families. An example from my own company, my company takes its relationship with communities very, very seriously. So the basic principle by which we operate is that if we're successful, if we prosper in an area, then the community has to prosper with us. Otherwise, it's not sustainable business. And just a little example from the Anambas Islands, where we have an operations base. The Anambas Islands, for those of you that don't know, the only real cash crop there is the growing of cloves for cigarettes and a little bit of low-value Robusta coffee. But it's a very big area for subsistence fishing. We worked with the subsistence fishermen there to basically what they were doing was cutting the fillets off their fish, selling the fillets to market and throwing the rest away. So there's a lot of waste. We just worked with them, gave them some seed capital and some scientific help. They now convert 100% of the fish that they harvest into usable product. So the fillets still go to market. The fish guts and the bones and so on get ground up, turned into fertilizer. And the fertilizer is used for an organic rice farming business. Rice had never been grown in the Anambas before, ever, in the history of settlement there. That group of farmers are now in there, and they terraced some old clove forest. That group of farmers now in its 6th or 7th harvest, and their yields are 5 times the rice yield in Java. So that's a community that's totally convinced that sustainable agriculture works.
So I'm going to ask you to thank our panelists. I don't think, having listened to that, you feel that the solutions are probably within a group of people like this for most companies in Indonesia and across Asia, this thinking about collaboration, thinking about future generations and grandmothers as well, children and grandmothers we've had on the panel, about consistency, about thinking holistically about your business, about setting ambitious goals, learning from others. These are all parts of the solution. We've had good questions. Sorry we didn't have time for more questions from the audience. There's an opportunity over lunch to grab our distinguished panelists and ask your question to them directly with more time in hand. And I'm sure that we can continue these discussions. Most of the companies are producing interesting reports telling these stories now, and you can read them online, you can read them published, and in the case of some of the companies, you can go and visit their projects as well. So I'm going to ask you to thank the panelists, and we'll move on to the next part of the program. Thank you very much, panelists.
And the organizers.